Reading from Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 26. Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple."
We continue our series on the life and witness of Dietrich Bonhoeffer today, that young pastor and theologian who was one of the first to speak out as Hitler and the Nazis seduced a nation and bullied a continent and implemented the final solution of the Jews in Europe. To review, Bonhoeffer played a key role in a small resistance movement of pastors and theologians called the Confessing Church, which was eventually silenced by the Nazis. He founded an underground seminary in Finkenwalde to train pastors in opposition to the German state church, which had been co-opted by the Nazis. It was there that he wrote his famous book, The Cost of Discipleship. And as the war dragged on, Bonhoeffer joined an unsuccessful plot to assassinate Hitler, which led to his arrest and imprisonment for more than a year, before being hanged in a concentration camp at Flossenburg at the age of 39. Bonhoeffer's witness in recent years has been increasingly exploited for political purposes, especially in the U.S., and most notably by politically conservative Christians. The most egregious abuse of Bonhoeffer's name and theology is actually found in the foreword to Project 2025, as moral justification for the conservative policy blueprint of the Heritage Foundation. Nearly 100 of Bonhoeffer's surviving family members have denounced this brazen misuse of his name. Bonhoeffer today would refuse to be anybody's political mascot. He was a pastor and theologian whose resistance to authoritarianism and Christian nationalism was shaped entirely by his theology and his commitment to honoring Christ above all other earthly powers and loyalties. As we've seen so far in the series, Bonhoeffer believed that the grace of God extends to us freely, and it requires some concrete response or action on our part, a costly grace, as he called it. A response that results in our acting differently in the world. Without a changed way of life, God's grace becomes what he called cheap grace. And Bonhoeffer believed that this response on our part is a matter of obedience to the commands Christ gives us in the moment we choose to follow. By obedience, he wasn't talking about a legalistic adherence to rules and laws, the do's and don'ts and oughts and shoulds of religion, but instead a genuine commitment to Jesus' radical teachings, like praying for our enemies and showing mercy and forgiveness, resisting evil and becoming peacemakers and praying. Bonhoeffer said famously that in that moment of decision to follow Christ, quote, the response is an act of obedience, not a confession of faith in Jesus. Simply put, what he was saying was, don't tell me you believe in Jesus, show me. Bonhoeffer is not for everyone, especially in America where churches are so determined to become more fashionable and palatable to an increasingly disinterested culture that they market Christianity as consumer-friendly and worship as seeker-sensitive, where in most mega-churches you're more likely to find a coffee bar and a lazy river than a cross, and where the Joel Osteens of the prosperity gospel couldn't even spell the name Bonhoeffer, let alone dare preach his message of costly grace. If Bonhoeffer seems too serious, consider his historical context and the deafening silence of his contemporaries in the face of Hitler's atrocities. For Bonhoeffer, it was no time for vacillating. The call to discipleship isn't for sensitive seekers. It requires us to live and act differently in the world. It must come at a cost. And we must ultimately make a choice to obey Christ or to submit to Hitler. For Bonhoeffer, that clarity of choice began to come into focus on January 30th, 1933, the very moment Hitler became the democratically elected Chancellor of Germany. 2 days later, a 26-year-old Bonhoeffer gave a radio address. His speech was about how leadership by a Führer inevitably becomes an idol and a misleader. But before he could finish his speech, the broadcast signal at the very most crucial moment in his speech was suddenly cut off. Radio silence. Imagine the confusion as families gathered around their radios in their sitting rooms, listening to this young theologian speaking daringly about a subject of national interest, following along as his argument against the Führer unfolded step by step rationally, setting the stage for his main point, which he was just about to deliver when suddenly the signal cuts out. Silence. Dead air. Nothing. To this day, it's unclear exactly what happened in that control room, but someone ostensibly had pulled the plug, if you will, and Bonhoeffer's speech came to an abrupt halt before he could utter the most provocative words in that manuscript. After questioning why German youth had placed so much hope in a strong leader and allowed their enthusiasm to be transformed from a political movement to a personality cult, what he was about to say next was this. Quote, the fearful danger of the present time, he said, is that above the cry for authority, be it of a leader or of an office, we forget that man stands alone before the ultimate authority, and that anyone who lays violent hands on man here is infringing eternal laws and taking upon himself superhuman authority, which will eventually crush him. Leaders, he said, which set themselves up as gods, mock God and the individual who stands alone before him and must perish. No one ever heard that daring pronouncement. But for Bonhoeffer, this was the moment when he made it publicly clear that there was no impermeable firewall between theology and politics. When most Germans were using theology to propagate a political agenda, Bonhoeffer used theology to question and test that agenda against the agenda of the gospel of Jesus. This is key to understanding Bonhoeffer. Every theological question has human and social and political dimensions, and every political claim has theological implications. If our theology does not touch the ground in the real world, then it is pure fantasy. And if our politics does not recognize God's ultimate authority within that world, then it is pure idolatry. This is what Jesus was trying to say when he made one of the most outrageous statements ever recorded in the Gospels. Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself cannot be my disciple. On the surface, it seems like an impossible and even dangerous teaching. Hate? That's an extreme word. It seems so contrary to everything we know about Jesus and what he teaches in the Gospels. But hating our mothers and fathers, our spouses and our kids, our siblings, and even our lives, this is one of those teachings that we wish Jesus would have clarified, or maybe just ended with an LOL or an IMAO or an LMAO or a JK or just maybe a smiling emoji? Before we get too worked up over this teaching about hating our families, let's be clear about one thing. We all have a family, either one we've come from or one we belong to, one we've created or one that has claimed us. Whether our families look like the Cleavers, the Waltons, the Simpsons of Springfield, or the Griffins of Quahog, the cast of Friends or the cast of The Office, none of us can live without some kind of family, either biological or social. Whatever family looks like to you, devotion to family is one of the most important concerns you will ever give your life to. Healthy families are the foundation of our sense of belonging, acceptance, and self-worth. They help us make sense of our origin, identity, our culture, and heritage. Because families are hard to create and harder still to hold together, they do require a devotion that transcends all other pursuits in life. Families can be a powerful source of incredible power in a person's life. But Jesus understood something else about families. Families can exert an incredible power over a person's life. For some people, their whole lives, past, present, future, are defined by their last names, bloodlines, inherited beliefs or politics or social status, by the roles they're expected to play, by the duties they're expected to perform. Some people are never permitted to leave the ranch. Some are expected to carry on the family business or carry on certain family traditions. Some are told, this is what we've always believed as a family. My daddy believed it and his daddy believed it. This is just who we are. Jesus understood the incredible power a family can have over a person's life, an unhealthy power that becomes this idolatrous tether, obligating us to the past and limiting our freedom. Jesus was speaking here to people whose futures had been predetermined by their relationships to their families. Have you ever noticed that throughout Scripture people are known by the names of their fathers? James and John are the sons of Zebedee. Levi and James are the sons of Alphaeus. That was the power of family in Jesus' day. It defined you, determined your destiny, required obedience, drew boundaries around who you would become and what you would do with your life and where you would go and where you couldn't go, so that you'd always be loyal to your family. If your father was a fisherman, that's what you'd be. A carpenter, a tax collector, a metalsmith, it was already laid out for you. Jesus proposes here that following him requires a departure from any loyalties that would make ultimate claims on our lives. The Greek word translated here as hate is miseo. It refers not to intense contempt or outward hostility toward a person. It means to love less than, or to value one thing over another. It conveys a sense of priority or value, so that following Christ means there will be moments when we will have to make hard choices. And sometimes those choices are between two seemingly good things, like God and family, or God and nation. Fred Craddock once told the story about this boy named Clyde who walked out of a little coal mining village in southwest Virginia. He was leaving home. He belonged to a family of 14 children, and he started working in the mine as a child. A teacher in grade school gave him some books to read at night, and at the end of grade school, that teacher asked him if he'd like to go on to high school. And the boy said, no, I'll have to go on to work like everybody else in my family. But the teacher helped him get into high school. And 4 years later, that same teacher said, would you like to go to college? And Clyde walked to the highway with everything he owned in a gunny sack. And he caught a bus and he went to college. And Craddock asked him one day, what was the hardest part? And Clyde said, it was not missing my family or my home. The hardest part was everybody who loved me said, don't leave. Why are you running away? You're betraying us. Why not just stay here? These people, they love you. Bonhoeffer said these moments of decision that arise in our lives require of us single-minded obedience. By obedience, he simply means responsible action. When Christ calls us, the invitation isn't to reflect on it or think about it and get back to you later, Jesus. The call is to some decisive action right there in the moment, to follow, to act according to Christ's command. And by single-minded obedience, Bonhoeffer means that we should always assume the command of Christ is straightforward. It means one concrete, clear thing. This doesn't mean we should become literalists. It simply means being honest about how we often rationalize and reason our way out of doing what we really know we must do, especially when it may require some form of suffering or discomfort. Bonhoeffer says Christ's call is always straightforward and concrete. When Jesus, for example, says, turn the other cheek, he doesn't mean twist back around so you can position yourself to get a really good swing on your counterpunch. When Jesus says, seek first the kingdom of God, he doesn't mean pursue other things first, but be prepared to bet everything on God if it really does come down to it. When he says, have mercy on the stranger and the outcast, he doesn't mean only if it's politically expedient. As Jews were being sent to ghettos and later hauled off to death camps while ordinary Germans were turning a blind eye, Bonhoeffer raises the question, what does single-minded obedience look like for followers of Christ? What concrete action might one be called to take here? Jesus calls it hating our family, but it's really about prioritizing our values and our commitments and loyalties. There are consequences and sometimes even contradictions that occur when we choose to follow God as Jesus does. Stated positively, maybe that means championing the cause of the vulnerable, or viewing our calling as more expansive than the confines of our religion or our country, or challenging unhealthy authorities and those who view those authorities as infallible, or maybe expanding our concept of family to include neighbors far and near, or maybe it's resisting those who mislead by setting themselves up as gods. Or maybe it's refusing to be a bystander, because bystander is both a noun and a verb. The opposite of single-mindedness is half-heartedness, reservedness, apathy. The Bible calls it over and again lukewarmness. Bonhoeffer noted that sin thrives whenever would-be disciples are less than single-minded in their obedience to Christ. In June 1939, Bonhoeffer left Germany on his second trip to New York City. By then, he had been banned from teaching, writing, and preaching. He had refused to serve in the army if he were to be drafted. He was, in other words, persona non grata. And his closest friends counseled him to go to New York City until things cooled down and he could return later to help rebuild what would be left of Germany. The hope was that Hitler would be overthrown and life would return to normal. And so he went, but within a few days of arriving in New York City, he was immediately homesick. His impression there was that American Christians had not really learned to trust God fully, preferring to forego suffering and live out their faith in freedom without a struggle. He said, the American churches had failed to reckon seriously with the scandal of the cross. Maybe he was remembering this radical teaching of Jesus: whoever does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Bonhoeffer knew he must return and share in the struggles with his people. And so within weeks, he boarded a ship back to Germany. He wrote, I made a mistake in coming to America. I shall have no right to take part in the restoration of Christian life in Germany after the war, unless I share the trials of this time with my people. It was a decision that would ultimately cost him his life. In the months and years that followed, he would spy, he would pray, he would plot to overthrow his government, he would write, and he would follow Jesus and take up his cross. Our takeaways for today: Christ's call is straightforward and concrete. Our response to Christ's call always requires decisive action in the moment. And decisive action sometimes requires us to choose between two seemingly good things.